Next, I am thrilled to introduce Stephen Handler, our first case study presenter, who's going to share his perspective on how he's putting these principles into action in his work at Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, or NIACS, where he's a climate change specialist. And his main role with NIACS is to coordinate the Northwoods Climate Change Response Framework, which involves building partnerships, assessing climate change risk, and working with forest managers and landowners to develop real-world projects to adapt and prepare for future change. Stephen moved to Houghton, Michigan in 2011 and loves being a Youper. Maybe you can tell us more about that in your case study too. Welcome, Stephen.
Thanks, Rachel. I'm going to try to share my screen now, so let me know if this goes through. Okay, so are you seeing the slide that opens my presentation?
Yep.
Great, thanks. All right, yeah, so I'm really happy to present with you all today. Thanks a lot, Rachel, for extending the invitation. I'm going to cover just one aspect of our work at NIACS. I'll give a brief explanation of who we are at NIACS. And then I'm really excited, Shamika, to hear your presentation as well. So please keep me honest with my time. So for those of you who aren't familiar with us, I'm guessing most of you, I am a federal employee. I work for the U.S. Forest Service for the Northern Research Station. I'm based here in Houghton, Michigan in the Upper Peninsula. That's why I'm a Youper, because I crave snow. But the group I work with, NIACS, is actually bigger than just the Forest Service. NIACS is a collaborative partnership among all of the organizations you see here on the screen, several universities, a national conservation organization, that's American Forests, a tribal commission, that's the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, also a forest industry science group, the National Council for Air and Stream Improvement. All of these organizations have come together to create NIACS. And NIACS is basically like a climate change help desk for land managers. We do outreach, education, technical assistance to anyone and everyone in the land management community. And we focus on these two topics of climate change adaptation and carbon management. So that's a little bit about our work. I focus mostly on climate adaptation, and I also focus mostly in the upper Midwest, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. But I have coworkers who work elsewhere around the region and really all across the country at this point. So I was given this challenge by Rachel to pick some aspect of our work at NIACS and think about how it really illustrates some of these principles in the Living Guide. And this was really interesting for me. Our organization, we are kind of organizational members of ASAP. But I'll say we're still getting comfortable also with talking about our work in this fashion. So this was fun for me. And so I'm going to highlight three specific principles today: recognizing context, using the best available science and knowledge, and networking and learning together. And I'll come back to these over the next 10 minutes. And I guess the specific aspect of our work that I'm using to illustrate these principles is a set of tools that we call adaptation menus. And I'll describe what those are, kind of show how they're used, and why they relate to these principles. So first of all, I'll say I'm going to be talking a lot about, forestry and land management. I know many of you are not coming from that discipline or that world, but I hope that this set of tools and these ideas are kind of translatable to really most of the disciplines that we're working on. So an adaptation menu at its core is really a structured list of adaptation actions. And we call it a menu because we have learned through time that you can't come in and tell people how exactly they should prepare for climate change and how they should adapt. Instead, what people really crave is choices and a sensible way to evaluate those choices and to scan those choices and have some ownership and some autonomy in choosing what adaptation actions make the most sense for their particular context. And so these menus are really designed to help do that. They're organized in a hierarchical fashion that kind of steps people down from more general concepts to more specific actions that you could implement on the ground, say in a specific forest stand or in a watershed that you're working on. Adaptation menus are also specific to a discipline. So we have an adaptation menu for forest management that looks quite a bit different than an adaptation menu for wildlife management. And that's because different disciplines speak different languages, have different priorities. Even if you're talking about ultimately the same action, you might have a different rationale for explaining that action to your peers and your coworkers. So our organization at NIAX, we started with a forestry specific adaptation menu. And I'm showing that, in a small box on the right-hand side of the screen here. But again, the point is that it's an organized, vetted list of different ways to adapt to climate change within a discipline, including ideas that are opposing each other, right? Resisting change in one section of the menu and actively encouraging a change on the other end of the menu. But the point is that it's an organized presentation of your choices that we can work with a land manager or a landowner and help them pick and choose from the menu items that make sense for their particular situation. And we have moved well beyond forestry at this point to a whole variety of disciplines kind of in the big arena of land management and ecosystem management. You see them on the screen here. And so I know, folks on the call here might not be foresters, but maybe some of these other menus are piquing your interest, whether it's urban forestry, watershed planning, tribal perspectives, coastal ecosystems. So maybe some of these are interesting to you. And just as a deeper dive here, just to show what I mean and what's contained in these menus. For example, we have a wildlife adaptation menu with 13 general strategies. This is the general level of specificity that's contained in our menu. And so in wildlife management, people talk about managing populations of wildlife species. They talk about managing habitat that wildlife depends on. There's also some ideas in here related to engaging human communities in wildlife conservation. So these are kind of the top headers in a wildlife adaptation menu. And then I mentioned that hierarchical organization. Within each general strategy, there are many nested approaches that get more specific. So that's the 3.1, 3.2, 3.3 that you see here on the screen. This is just an example to show how a general idea contains many more specific ideas that really start to get a lot more clarity on, okay, how could adaptation work in this general idea? And then we also include some example tactics that show in a real life situation, how has this adaptation idea been implemented in the real world? So again, providing context and examples for managers to pick and choose from.
Stephen, about 5 minutes left.
Great, thank you. We use these adaptation menus as part of an overall planning process called the Adaptation Workbook, where we help managers consider where they're working, how their particular place has unique climate risks, whether their management goals and objectives still hold up, and then ultimately we help them pick and choose ideas from these menus. And so this is really how we recognize context in climate adaptation is that the decision makers, landowners, land managers, folks working in the field, they're the ones who get to choose what adaptations actions are most appropriate, and we nest it in a process that helps them articulate their specific context. These menus are also generated by drawing from the best available science and knowledge. So for example, we did a wide-ranging literature review to support the creation of that wildlife adaptation menu that I just showed you, to draw ideas from published literature on wildlife management, and then test those ideas with land managers to network and learn together and hear feedback from those managers prior to publication. So it's really an iterative process, learning from the community of managers that menu is designed to serve. And this is a process we take with all of our adaptation menus, not just researching and publishing, but doing that back and forth with managers to really learn together and network. Something I really like about the way ASAP articulates this principle is that it's not just best available science. It's best available science and information, and I think that's intentional because sometimes our best information is not drawn from scientific literature. And an example of this is that we have an adaptation menu that is specifically designed to express tribal and indigenous perspectives on climate adaptation. And I'm showing a link here on the screen. This was an adaptation menu that's written with tribal partners from across the Midwest that expresses their values and kind of can be a communication tool to bridge between tribal and non-tribal organizations that are trying to work together on climate adaptation.
2 minutes left, Stephen.
Thank you. The other thing these adaptation menus help facilitate, that third principle that I highlighted, networking and learning together. At this point, NIAX has launched over 500 real-world adaptation demonstrations using this whole library of menus and our adaptation workbook process. And the beauty here is that all of these examples from around the country have used the same process, and they have picked and chosen their adaptation actions from the same lists. And now they have a common language to share their ideas and discuss different routes towards adaptation with each other and as a community. And so we're using this as a way to create that community of practice. So that is where I will wind it up. And hopefully that was a useful illustration.
Thank you so much, Stephen. That was wonderful. I'm